There are stories from the Second World War that sound too strange to be true. A submarine that stalked ships beneath the Pacific is one thing. A submarine that sent 8 sailors ashore, moved across enemy territory, found a railway, placed explosives beneath the tracks, and then watched a train come apart is something else entirely. In July 1945, the war in the Pacific was entering its final and most dangerous weeks. Japan was still fighting, but the balance had already shifted beyond recovery. American submarines had spent years strangling Japanese shipping, cutting supply routes, sinking merchant vessels, and forcing an island nation dependent on imported resources to fight with less and less. Among those submarines was USS Barb. Barb was a Gato-class submarine, built for a war that demanded patience, endurance, and an almost unnatural willingness to spend weeks inside a steel tube beneath the ocean. Her crew had already developed a reputation for aggressive patrols. They were not simply looking for targets, they were looking for opportunities. By the summer of 1945, Commander Eugene Flucky was in command. Flucky understood that the most valuable targets were not always the largest ships. Sometimes the important thing was to disrupt the machinery behind the front lines: fuel, transportation, communications, and movement. Barb's final patrol would take her north toward the Japanese island of Hokkaido and the nearby territory of Karafuto, then under Japanese control. The coastline there was different from the tropical islands most people associate with the Pacific War. It was colder, more remote, and shaped by forests, mountains, railways, and long stretches of coastline. And there was something else, a railway. The Japanese railway network was more than a collection of tracks. It was a lifeline. Trains carried coal, equipment, food, troops, and supplies between ports, industrial areas, and military positions. A ship could be replaced. A train could be replaced. But interrupting the railway at the right moment could cause an entire chain of movement to stop. Barb began watching the coast. From the submarine, the crew could see little more than darkness, distant lights, and the occasional silhouette. They had to understand the terrain without being able to walk through it. They had to judge distances from the sea and determine where the railway ran. Then they saw a train. The locomotive moved through the darkness along the coast, its headlight cutting through the night. Smoke rose behind it and disappeared into the black sky. From a distance, it looked ordinary. That was precisely what made it interesting. A ship could be attacked from the sea. A train could not easily. The problem was that Barb was offshore. The railway was on land. The submarine's weapons could not simply reach into the countryside and destroy the track. If the crew wanted to do something about that train, they would have to leave the safety of the submarine. That was the moment when the mission became something far more unusual. Flucky decided to send men ashore. 8 sailors were selected for the shore party. They were not going in as a conventional infantry unit. They had no artillery, no armored vehicles, and no support waiting behind them. Their job was simple in theory and extremely dangerous in practice. Get to the railway, place an explosive charge, and get back to the submarine before Japanese forces discovered what they were doing. They moved toward the coast in small rubber boats. The ocean was dark. The submarine remained offshore while the boats approached the Japanese-controlled shoreline. Every stroke of the oars had to be controlled. Every sound mattered. The sailors knew that if they were discovered, there would be no easy rescue. They reached land and disappeared into the darkness. The 8 men moved inland, using the terrain for cover. They had to locate the railway without attracting attention. The landscape was unfamiliar, and the darkness made every distance uncertain. Then came another problem. They were not exactly where they had expected to be. For a moment, the entire operation depended on whether they could orient themselves before daylight or before someone noticed them. They moved carefully through vegetation and along narrow paths. Somewhere nearby were Japanese positions, roads, and railway workers. The men could not afford to behave like an ordinary patrol. They had to move like people who were not supposed to be there. Eventually, they found the railway. The tracks disappeared into the darkness in both directions. Now the mission became a matter of timing. The sailors prepared the explosive charge beneath the rails. They worked close to the ground, using their hands and simple equipment. One man watched the surrounding darkness while the others concentrated on the track. Then they heard it, a train. At first it was only a distant sound. Then the rhythm became clearer. Metal wheels, machinery, the growing rumble of a locomotive approaching through the darkness. The sailors froze. The train was coming toward the exact section of track where they had been working. There was no room for hesitation. They moved away from the rails and concealed themselves. The locomotive appeared. Its headlight grew larger. Steam and smoke rolled through the night. The train moved closer, unaware that 8 enemy sailors were hiding nearby and that something had been placed beneath the track. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the train reached the charge. The explosion tore through the railway. The locomotive was thrown violently upward. Freight cars behind it left the rails and crashed into one another. Steel twisted. Smoke and debris filled the darkness. The railway that had been quiet only seconds earlier became a field of wreckage. The sailors did not stay to admire what they had done. They turned and ran. Their mission was only half finished. Destroying the train was one problem. Getting back to Barb was another. The coastline was still ahead of them. The submarine was waiting offshore. But now the Japanese knew something had happened. The men pushed through the darkness toward the boats. Behind them, smoke rose above the railway. The sound of the wreckage echoed across the coast. Every minute mattered. They reached the shoreline and climbed back into the rubber boats. Then they began rowing. Out on the water, USS Barb waited in darkness. Inside the submarine, the crew watched for the returning boats. They had no way of knowing exactly what had happened on land. They could only wait and hope that all 8 men would return. The boats finally appeared. One by one, the sailors were pulled aboard. They were exhausted, wet, and covered in the evidence of the night they had just survived. But they were alive. Barb did not remain in the area. The submarine moved away from the coast and disappeared back into the Pacific. The operation had been small compared with the enormous battles taking place across the Pacific. There were no divisions involved, no bomber formations, no tanks, no massive fleet, just 8 sailors, a railway, an explosive charge, and a train. But that was part of what made the story remarkable. The raid showed a different kind of submarine warfare. Barb had not simply attacked from beneath the sea. Her crew had projected the submarine's reach onto land. The submarine had become a launching point for a small ground operation. And the story did not end with the explosion. Barb's final patrol became one of the most celebrated patrols in American submarine history. Her crew had accumulated an extraordinary record of enemy ships and targets destroyed during the war, and the final mission added an almost unbelievable episode to that record. When the submarine returned, the men carried with them the story of what had happened on the Japanese coast. The battle flag associated with Barb would later reflect the patrol's achievements, including the destruction of the railway train. The small symbol represented something much larger than a single locomotive. It represented the willingness of the crew to to leave the relative safety of their submarine and enter enemy territory themselves. And there was an important detail hidden inside the story. The sailors had not been ordered to become heroes. They were simply doing a job. That is often how the most extraordinary wartime actions begin. There was no guarantee that the mission would work. There was no guarantee that the train would arrive at the right moment. There was no guarantee that the men would find their way back to the boats. Every part of the operation depended on a chain of small decisions. First, someone had to notice the railway. The idea itself was simple, but carrying it out was anything but simple. The men would have to leave the relative safety of the submarine and enter territory controlled by the Japanese. They would have to cross the shoreline in darkness, find the railway, and somehow place the explosives without being discovered. And once the charge was in position, there would be no room for mistakes. They would have to wait for the right train. 8 men now stood between the submarine and the railway, carrying out a mission that could easily have ended with none of them making it back. They had no heavy weapons and no backup waiting nearby. Their greatest advantage was surprise, and once that was gone, the coastline could become a trap. Still, they went ashore. The small boats moved quietly toward the coast, while USS Barb remained offshore, its crew watching from the darkness. As the sailors disappeared into the night, those aboard the submarine could do little except wait. Somewhere beyond the shoreline, 8 men were now moving through unfamiliar territory, searching for the railway that would become the target of one of the strangest attacks of the entire Pacific War. The most dangerous part may have been the final one. Once the explosion happened, the sailors no longer had the advantage of surprise. Their mission was no longer hidden. Somewhere along the coast, Japanese personnel would have known that a train had been destroyed. The sailors were now moving through enemy territory, while the entire coastline could potentially become a search area. They reached the boats and pushed into the water. Behind them, the railway remained damaged. Ahead of them was the submarine. Between the two was open water. The oars moved through the darkness as the men headed toward Barb. The submarine's silhouette slowly became clearer. One by one they climbed aboard. The hatch closed, and the operation was over. For the sailors, it was another mission. For history, it became something much larger, because the image is almost impossible to forget. A submarine offshore, 8 sailors moving through enemy territory at night, a train approaching along a railway, and a single explosion, turning an ordinary journey into one of the strangest attacks of the Pacific War. But the real story of USS Barb is not simply that it destroyed a train. It is that the crew refused to think of a submarine as a machine that could only fight at sea. They saw a target, they saw a weakness, and they found a way to reach it. That mindset had defined Barb's patrols throughout the war. The submarine was built from steel, machinery, batteries, torpedoes, and diesel engines. But none of those things made the final decision. People did. People looking through periscopes, people studying maps, people listening to the sound of a distant locomotive, people willing to leave the submarine and walk into the darkness. By August 1945, the Pacific War was approaching its end. The enormous machinery of war was beginning to slow. The battles that had seemed endless were nearing their final chapter. USS Barb had already done its part. For the men aboard her, the train raid was only one episode in a much longer story. For everyone who studies submarine warfare today, it remains one of the clearest examples of how unconventional thinking could turn a small opportunity into an extraordinary operation. The train was gone. The railway was damaged. The 8 sailors were back aboard, and USS Barb was once again beneath the ocean. There would be no dramatic battlefield photograph showing exactly what happened that night. No perfect image of the explosion, no clean cinematic record of 8 men disappearing into the darkness and returning hours later. There was only the record they left behind: a submarine, a coastline, a railway, a train, and 8 men who went ashore. That is why the story of USS Barb still feels almost unbelievable decades later, not because the explosion was the biggest of the war. It wasn't. Not because the raid involved hundreds of men. It didn't. It was remarkable because of its scale. A handful of sailors saw an opportunity and acted on it. And somewhere in the final weeks of the Pacific War, a Japanese train entered a dark stretch of railway without knowing that the enemy had already reached the tracks beneath it. A few seconds later, the train was no longer on the rails, and USS Barb was already disappearing into the darkness.